thought it might be interesting just to explain why I wrote this novel, Hill 112. As I've explained in the first video, it's about D-Day and the Battle for Normandy, and we see it through the eyes of three youngsters. One of them's 20, the others are 19 going on 20. They've all come from the same school in a fictional town in South Wales on the Bristol Channel. I don't mention the name, though it is drawn very much from where I live. So it does have a basis in reality, but I thought rather than tie myself down to being very specific as to these are people from this real place, that's a bit restrictive for a novel. And in the end, that doesn't matter so much. Now, the novel follows them. One of them lands on D-Day itself, commanding a troop of Sherman tanks in a fictional regiment. Again, I'll do another video talking about the units that I've used in the story, the two main ones that are fictional, but everything else that are real, and how I used actual incidents to represent what the fictional units do. But in the introduction, I said a little bit about, well, you know, we've got the 80th anniversary of D-Day coming up very soon. There'll be a tension, but the way the newspapers and the media tend to work, and TV, is that there'll be lots of focus. There'll probably be some big ceremonies on or around the 6th of June itself. There'll be lots of documentaries on television. They'll dig out the old war films. They'll show those. There might be some new documentaries. I think the BBC are doing something where they have personal accounts, I think actual recordings with people from the times, but they have actors dressed up and lip syncing to make it look as if that person is telling the story. Presumably that person when young, I guess, or are they, so from the time rather than when they recorded the interview. That might be significantly later. I'm not sure. I think there'll be some good stuff, some interesting stuff. There'll be lots of retreaded stuff. There'll be, as I say, books and good non-fiction coming out. But there isn't a lot of fiction written about the Second World War, particularly the Second World War for the soldiers involved. You get lots of home front stuff, you get loads of espionage stuff, you get resistance, evasion, spies, this sort of thing, escaping prisoners of war. There has always been a reluctance, and it's the same in cinema and TV. You don't get too much in the Second World War that's about the actual fighting by those who are taking part, partly because such things are very expensive to make. And particularly dealing with the role of British troops in that, because Britain hasn't had the money to make that sort of film. And in the 50s, the heyday of the British war film, they tended to make more about the desert or the Navy or the Air Force or, again, prisoners of war rather than soldiers actually in the fighting line. But there's a lot more to the story of D-Day and Normandy than just June the 6th itself, just the invasion beaches. And even there, you know, the focus on those tends to be on the early hours of the landing. And we can forget that neither the situation had been on much of Omaha Beach. By the end of the day they had taken it, they were pushing inland. And plenty of people land on D-Day who were not in those first waves, who were not being actively targeted by people, defenders on the beach. So they might have still been sporadically shelled, but basically the defences have already been overrun. And they're, again, coming ashore, pushing inland. But the battle for Normandy goes on for 10 weeks or so after June. You know, it's not resolved until August. The British don't take Caen for the best part of a month, and they've, you know, bombed the thing to blazes with Bomber Command before they do that. The number of units involved increases steadily, but the beachhead doesn't expand to keep proportion with them, so it's a very crowded area. There are lots of prolonged attritional battles, and many offensives launched by the Allies fall far short of achieving the full objectives of breakthrough and breakout. On the other hand, all the German offensives also fail. They don't drive the Allies back into the sea, and they don't come any remotely close to it at any point. But the casualties keep piling up. It was one of the other possible titles for the book, but again, it was rejected. The British Army in its planning for D-Day obviously had to work out what were the expected losses going to look like, what sort of proportion should we expect to lose, because that means what are the medical facilities we need to deal with, this sort of number of likely wounded at any time, how do we get them through, but also how many replacements do we need. And they worked on two scales, normal and intensive. During the course of the Battle for Normandy, they had to create a third one, double intensive, because everything was happening far more quickly and the casualties were far higher than everyone had expected. So a lot of the fighting in Normandy occurs after D-Day, it occurs inland, and that's the real experience, the main experience. D-Day was one day, and in some respects it's hours of one day, with a huge amount of preparation beforehand. And a lot of the preparation was devoted to those few hours and getting everybody ashore and achieving a beachhead, but it also had to be devoted to what would happen next. The battle of the build-up, getting more troops to the area than the Germans could do. So this is the story of that battle seen through these three youngsters. It does mean that it's very much the point of view of British soldiers at that time, and one's in an armoured unit, two others are in infantry battalion. One commanding a platoon, one is just a Bren gunner, so a private giving you. So you get different points of view. So I wanted to try and explore not all, but a significant part of the experience of the fighting and what it meant, because this was very much an attritional First World War battle fought with far more dangerous, deadly, longer range, more effective weapons. Even the artillery, yes, a lot of the guns were similar, but the way they were used was far more sophisticated, more dangerous. And the battlefield was a lot more deadly, and it's one of those things I don't think many people realize, unless they have an interest in these things and have read about them, that the casualty rates in Normandy were every bit as high as they had been in the infamous battles of the First World War, like the Somme and Passchendaele, for those actually in the fighting line. The British army that goes to Normandy and the Canadian army that's organised in the same way, and the Polish divisions and other that will join later, they send more gunners to Normandy than they send infantrymen, and that reflects the structure of the British and Canadian armies by that time. There are more artillerymen than there are infantrymen, and that's even if you restrict artillerymen to a fairly narrow group, and you're not talking about all the service corps drivers who are driving up the lorries with supplies of shells and the like, and other equipment to feed the guns. The British army in Normandy, even including the strong Canadian contingent, Polish division later on, other bits and bobs, is far, far smaller than the BEF of late 1917, 1918, the one that had played such a major role in winning the First World War. Britain didn't field as big an army in the Second World War in terms of combat divisions, people actually at the front line fighting, as it had in the First World War. And that's one of the reasons why overall casualties in the Second World War are about a third of those for the British as they had been in the First World War. But for those who were actually doing the fighting was just as dangerous, the risks just as high. Yes, you didn't have the horrors of gas, you didn't have some aspects of the First World War, but nevertheless, and the medical services were far better, so your chances of survival had improved. They'd improved significantly during the course of the First World War, but they'd come on yet again by the Second World War. Even so, for all that, it was still incredibly dangerous. And the life expectancy for a British or Canadian platoon commander, a subaltern, a junior officer who arrives with an infantry unit before he becomes a casualty being killed, wounded or captured, was actually lower in Normandy than it had been on the Somme in 1916. I don't think people realise this. I don't think they realise the deadliness, the danger, the intensity of all this fighting. So that this is the story, the sort of history behind the novel, is to explain to people of just what it meant for those who were there, and to remember them, because we tend to have, particularly in Britain, there is this perception the First War was the terrible war, and it leads to this weird perception. Most soldiers who went to the First World War in the British Army and Commonwealth armies, or Dominion armies as they were then, they didn't die. Most people survived. It's a minority who get killed. It's a very big minority. It's a huge number of people. Overall, with Britain and the Empire, it's close to 1 million casualties, which is not as bad as those suffered by France, Germany, Austria, let alone Russia. Nevertheless, it's still huge. By the standards of within British society, there hadn't been this tradition of large armies fighting continental wars. We always relied historically on allies to a greater extent for most of the manpower. Big navy, yes, but not a big army. That changed for the First World War, to some extent for the Second World War, but those are the unusual, those are the blips in British history. And the proportion, the high levels of volunteering you had, say, in Canada or Australia, New Zealand and like, particularly in the First World War, and in some of them in the Second World War as well. is very, very large, and we don't, we sometimes make that normal and we forget that this was unusual. There were reasons why that. But again, comes back to the fact, for those doing the fighting, the Second World War was just as dangerous, and in some respects more so. And I don't think people understand that. So I've tried to tell a story where you don't know what's going to happen to the characters. And that's the theme. So it's trying to give people a flavour, an idea of D-Day and Normandy and of the army that fought in them, at least of one section of it. It also drew upon a story that I heard many years ago when I was growing up. I grew up in a small town on the coast of South Wales, overlooking the Bristol Channel. You can see Devon and Dorset, Devon, sorry, rather, not Dorset, unless you've got very, very good eyesight, out of my window from where I'm filming now. I went to a small boys' prep school, and chap who just sold on the business, had been a headmaster, had been a teacher since before the Second World War, been one of those men who's a real Mr. Chips type character, been all the way through. He'd just sold the business, but was staying on to teach for a little bit and help the new owners run the place. He also lived not far from where we lived, so he never taught me. He did teach my older brother, and he had a great interest in cricket, and then he'd been to Teddy Hall in Oxford, and when later on, as the years passed, I went to St John's, he used to take a particular interest. He knew Oxford and the university and wanted to talk about these things. Now, it was said, and I was told this story, I cannot vouch for its 100% truth, that whilst he was still teaching in the school, he had a photograph in his office of a class of boys of maybe 20 or so. This was a prep school that only went up to age 13. And this photograph dated to the 1930s, and it was said that none of those boys survived the Second World War. Now, the historian in me suspects that that's probably at most an exaggeration, or at least an exaggeration, in that I suspect a lot of them tragically died, but not all of them, just because it may have happened. You do get these terrible statistical flukes, in the same way there are those half dozen or so villages in Britain who didn't lose anybody from the parish. No one was killed during the First World War. That's very, very rare. But it did point out the fact that if you were from that background, if you went to a prep school like that and then probably went on to boarding school, or perhaps left school at 14 or something like that, or maybe went to the local grammar or local private schools for a higher level, you came out, if you were the right age, if you reached adulthood during the Second World War, then you were of the educational background, the social expectation, and probably your own desire to play a part in things and to become the aircrew, to become a subaltern in the infantry in the army, or in an armoured unit of cavalry, to be junior officers in the navy, basically to do all the most dangerous jobs that fell to anyone in the Second World War in the British context. So it is perfectly possible that a whole group of 18, 20 or so boys all became casualties, all were killed during the war. At the very least, quite a few of them may have been, because there were, you look at the rolls of honour in schools like that, and they tend to be very, very large, very extensive, for the size of a school, portion to it. And that was another reminder that, again, if you happen to be doing certain jobs, then this wasn't a walkover compared to the First World War. This wasn't easier, this wasn't less dangerous, it was every bit as dangerous or more so. And the other thing that's always interested me is, of course, these boys, these youngsters, these men who went into to fight the Second World War, they were generally speaking the children of the generation that have fought the First World War. So they had grown up with stories of the Somme, of the mud of Passchendaele, of the big German offensive in 1918, of trenches full of mud and rats and all this thing, of battalions attacking and 3 men being left in a company at the end of the day, of the First World War has become a caricature in the popular memory of every battle being a pointless slaughter. It was more than that. It was far more complicated than that, and you didn't stay living in a trench month after month, year after year, and all this sort of thing. But nevertheless, some of that, those cliched, that sort of caricature of it had already developed in the 20s and 30s. These boys had grown up with this. And yes, they might have read Biggles and the sort of more optimistic take on it as well, but they knew how bad wars could be. So they weren't in a sense as naive in the same way as the First World War generation, where for the first time you had mass volunteering, then ultimately conscription in Britain. People went off to war expecting it all to be over by Christmas, and all, they felt obliged to go. They were excited to go. There was an optimism. Britain hadn't experienced wars on the scale of the Franco-Prussian War, of earlier conflicts, hadn't had anything like this since the Napoleonic Wars, hadn't had those losses that were more culturally familiar, if you can use the expression, to someone in France or Germany like that. A sense that wars happen and that they tend to be deadly, and you might be called up and sent off to fight in battles you don't understand, where there's a very high risk of being maimed, being killed. So I wanted to look at these, in a sense, the story is based on, I've got three boys, three youngsters, we'd consider them boys now, none of them are 21, who go off to war. And they're all not from the same class in a little prep school, but I've made them all, they'd all been in the same cricket team that had done rather well, and beaten all the bigger schools nearby for a year or two before they'd each gone their separate way to boarding school or elsewhere. And they're the only three left from that team, because everybody else has, at the very least, been posted missing, but many of them have been killed or died of disease, accident, all of the things, all of the extra dangers that could happen when you're being posted all around the world. And of course, before that in the Blitz in Britain itself. So it's based upon that personal element. So it combines those two things in one that I don't think people realise just how dangerous Normandy was. And by extension, many of the other battles of the Second World War. I'm writing about a few characters in Normandy. I can't write about the whole Second World War. I can't give the experience of other nations. I'll talk a bit about that, and particularly the Canadian role in Normandy, in another video, because that's something that never gets as much attention outside Canada itself as it deserves to, because they did play a very, very significant part in the campaign, as they did in many other aspects of the Second World War. But they don't tend to figure in the movies. I don't know whether you see any Canadians at all in The Longest Day, very few, certainly. For their proportion, there are probably more Free French soldiers as well as the resistance shown in the big set pieces of the film. Which, fair enough, collaboration of the French in making the film, French significant French story is one that is worth telling, but in terms of numbers involved, there were far more Canadian soldiers, some obviously French-Canadian, but far more Canadians involved than there were French troops. So again, it's how things are perceived. So I've tried to, this is very much a book about the experience of a few young British soldiers in the army, in Normandy, in battle, over a matter of weeks. But it's about that as giving you a taste of one aspect of it. It's not denying that there are other bigger stories, there are other people involved and all this sort of thing. But again, I'll talk about that in a different video. So it's personal in the sense that this is something that I think needs to be told. And while it's been told very well in non-fiction, a novel might reach other people, might spark some things. There were things I learned doing this that I'd not known before or not realised. And I've been reading about this since I was a kid, very enthusiastically. I already had quite an extensive collection of books. I'd read even more from the local library but that's before I started working on this. And I've been mulling over this book for the best part of 10 years. It just seemed like something that I really wanted to do, wanted to get out of my system. So it's personal in that sense. It's personal because that connection with the school I went to, and this memory, even if garbled, of the price paid by that generation of boys who'd gone to the school then, but also of these, they're not, it's a minor private school in a small town in South Wales. It's not the sort of Evelyn Waugh country of the aristocracy and all this sort of thing, nor is it quite the kitchen sink, everybody coming from a tough background. But there are elements of the latter in particular, because you're going into the army and you're in this melting pot, this mixing with people that you would never otherwise have met, and getting to know and respect and like many of them, and not in the case of others, and learn things about you. So that it's tried to have all of that. It's tried to, I've made them characters. I'm always a little bit bothered when you get descriptions like this is, the greatest generation, or these were all heroes, everyone who was there, because the ones who were there don't tend to talk in those terms. The thing that has always struck me is from people I met when they were older, knew when I was growing up, or when I've read about, the people involved were really ordinary. They were normal human beings pitched into extraordinary times that made them experience some really terrible things, but also some strangely exciting, important things. The number of people who would say that they never ever in their life had friends as close as the mates they had in the army under that pressure, because you just depended on each other utterly, is always a striking thing. So anyway, I'm going off and wandering off into too many other things, but that was the purpose of writing this book. That's the inspiration for Hill 112, and next time I think we'll look at the characters and what I'm trying to do with their stories.